Hi, class. I hope you're having a good day today. I am here with you today to talk about the writer Ernest Hemingway and his short story from 1925 called Soldier's Home. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed reading the story. I'm going to spoil the ending, so make sure that you've read it before you watch this video. So I chose this story for a couple reasons. One, I'm a big fan of Hemingway. I really like his unique style of writing. We'll say a little bit more about that. I also love this story because I feel like it presents a very nuanced portrayal of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? PTSD. Okay, so when Hemingway wrote this story, they didn't call it PTSD, right? They referred to it as shell shock. And what am I talking about, right? The experiences of a veteran, right, who's come home from his or her experiences, right, in the military, in the war. Okay, so this story is about a young man in his early 20s named Harold Krebs, who we learn, right, has just come home from serving as a Marine in World War I. Okay, so we see, right, how much he has changed, right? How much he has been affected by the war and how that affects his ability to interact with his family and with girls and other people who live in his hometown. Okay, the story is called Soldier's Home, referring to the setting, right? It takes place in his home. But of course, we also have mention of other settings, right? Settings that Krebs, where he was when he was serving in the war. Okay, so that's why I really like this story. I don't think we've read anything quite like it yet. Okay, so I'm excited to talk about it with you. So I'm going to start by saying something about Hemingway. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen so we can pull that up. Okay, so you should see him right there. He is on the screen. Ernest Hemingway, you can see that he lived from 1899 to 1961. Okay, he is from Oak Park, Illinois, right? That is a suburb of Chicago. It's only 9 miles from the city. Hemingway was not a big fan of living in Oak Park. So he wrote, and this is a quote, right, that it felt like the squarest community in the United States, right? He once said, and this is another quote, that it was full of wide lawns and narrow minds, and that it was the place where the bars ended and the churches began. Okay, now this is a picture of his house, right? The house where he was born and raised, right? And lived until he was 18 years old. And all I can say is, wow, that is a beautiful home, right? You can go there. It is currently a museum, right? You can go see the house, walk through it. This is a picture of him with his family. So Hemingway is on the right. So he was the second child in a family of 6 children. His father, Clarence Hemingway, was an obstetrician. So that is the kind of doctor that delivers babies, right? And that is something that comes up in some of Hemingway's works, right? His father also suffered from depression. His mother, Grace Hemingway, had been an opera singer prior to getting married. She was very religious, and she also, according to Hemingway, had a very overbearing personality. So these are 2 pictures of Hemingway as a child, and I need to just say something about this twinship experiment. So a lot of critics write about this. Hemingway's mother had always wanted to have twins. And so when Ernest was born, only 9 months after his older sister Marceline was born, I'm sorry, not 9 months, 15 months, excuse me for that mistake, right? 15 months apart, she decided to raise them as twins. And so for the first 5 or 6 years of their life, she tended to dress them alike. So here you can see Hemingway's dressed like a girl, right? There were other instances where she dressed them both as boys, right? She had them start school together, right? Again, even though they were 15 months apart, right? And she encouraged them to feel like twins, having everything alike, okay? There's been a lot written about this, right? And how this might have affected Hemingway, right? In one of his biographies that I read, right, there's actually an excerpt from a letter that Hemingway wrote to Santa Claus when he was young, where he expressed some concern that Santa Claus wouldn't know that he was a boy. Okay. Okay, now why am I bringing this up? Well, it's interesting because Hemingway is often criticized for his representation of men and women, right? So a lot of his male characters tend to be these sort of macho men, right? These, I guess, what we call today manly men, right? Very anxious to assert their masculinity. Whereas a number of his female protagonists, sometimes, right, they can tend to be a little bit more passive, right, overly feminine. And some people have speculated that perhaps his mother's twinship experiment instilled in Hemingway, right, a sharp desire to distinguish between the sexes, right, between men and women. Okay, so moving on, right, some important events in his life. Well, he graduated from high school in 1917, right? Initially, he wanted to be a journalist. So he moved to Missouri and started working for the Kansas City Star, right? Of course, this was when World War I was already raging, right? World War I, 1914 to 1918, right? The US entered the war in 1917, and right away, Hemingway wanted to enlist, okay? Now, he had some issues with his vision that prevented him from joining the military. So instead, he enlisted in the American Red Cross, right? The ambulance corps. And so he served as an ambulance driver in France and Italy during World War I. And in 1918, unfortunately, he was injured, right? He was actually passing out chocolates to Italians who were serving on the front lines, and he got hit, right? Both of his legs were hit by machine gun fire. And while he was in the hospital recovering from his injuries, he fell in love with his nurse, okay, an American woman who was 8 years older than him. That was his first love. And he thought he was going to marry her. When he returned, right, he was, they exchanged letters for a long period of time. And then finally, she broke the news, which was that she had fallen in love with someone else. And that was very upsetting, right, very traumatizing to young Hemingway. Also, right, worth noting, right, and this is definitely relevant to the story that we're going to be talking about, right, readjustment to life in Oak Park was very difficult. So he felt alienated from his family and unsure of what he wanted to do with his life, very similar to the way Krebs felt. Shortly after, right, he got married, 1921, right, he was only 22 years old. He married his first wife, Hadley Richardson. Her family, right, lucky for them, had money. And so they were able to live as expatriates, right? So they lived in Paris for several years. They had one son, right? These are some pictures of Hemingway and Hadley, right, living in Paris, right? You can see hanging out at cafes, right? Also on bottom right, picture with the American writer Gertrude Stein, who also lived as an expatriate in Paris. Then in 1924, Hemingway was only 25 years old when he published his first book, In Our Time, which is, it's not a novel actually, it's a collection of closely related short stories. So a lot of the stories deal with the same protagonist, right? A young man named Nick Adams. Those alternate with stories of war. Okay, now the story that we're talking about today, Soldier's Home, comes from this collection, In Our Time. Hemingway's first novel was The Sun Also Rises, that came out in 1926, right? So in that novel, right, the main protagonist, Jake Barnes, he's injured, right? And his injury is very interesting, right? Very metaphorical, right? His wounds leave him sexually impotent. Now, if you're not sure what that means, it means that he's unable to sustain an erection. So he cannot have, sex. And in a sense, again, if you think about this, what that suggests, that the lost generation, right, that they've been irrevocably damaged by the war. The war has taken away, you could say, right, his masculinity. 1927, Hemingway married his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer. They had two sons, Patrick and Gregory. 1928, Hemingway's father committed suicide. Okay, Hemingway was only 29, and he viewed his father's suicide as a cowardly act, and he put some of the blame on his mother, who he called a quote-unquote all-American bitch. And my favorite Hemingway novel, 1929, A Farewell to Arms, right, which is also very autobiographical, right? It is about a young man named Frederick Henry, who is an ambulance driver in World War I, who's injured in Italy while he's eating macaroni and cheese, actually, not passing out chocolates to soldiers, but he also falls in love with his nurse. 1940, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and then 1940, Hemingway married his third wife. 1946, he married his fourth wife. 1957, the publication of The Old Man and the Sea. 1952, he won the Pulitzer Prize for The Old Man and the Sea. And then in 1955, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Then sadly, in 1961, Hemingway took his own life. Okay, so he had been struggling with depression, right? He had actually had electroshock treatments to try to, to cope with the depression. It didn't work, tried different things. And then finally, he just gave up and he shot himself in the head with a 12-gauge double-barreled shotgun. And his body is buried right underneath those beautiful trees at his home in Ketchum, Idaho. Now, initially, after he died, it was believed to be an accident, right? His wife said that he was, she believed he was cleaning his gun. You can see, right, also here in this headline, author slain cleaning gun in his home, right? Then it was later, right, revealed that it was not actually an accident. It was, unfortunately, a suicide. Now, Hemingway is, probably one of the more popular authors that we're focusing on this semester. Why is he so popular? Well, he's known for his very unique style of writing, and also known for what we might view as masculine forms of self-assertion in the public eye. Okay, so he was a big game hunter. He was an amateur boxer. He was a deep sea fisherman, and he was a war journalist. Okay. And as much as I love Hemingway, the writer, I just find it despicable, right, that he was big, going to Africa, places like that, and killing animals, right? I just hate even looking at these pictures. So I do not endorse this at all. Right. And so he was, a war journalist, right, who actually got onto the battlefield when he was covering the war. He wasn't content to just do it from the sidelines, right? So he covered the Spanish Civil War, he covered the Greco-Turkish War, and he was also there for the Battle of the Bulge during World War II, for which he received a Bronze Star. He was also fascinated with bullfighting, right? If you read The Sun Also Rises, he writes about that, right? And he actually ran with the bulls in Pamplona, Spain. So all these extreme activities that he participated in, right? These very dangerous activities that Hemingway participated in, maybe we might view this as a way of dealing with death in a ritualized way, sort of a kind of existential sensibility. Hemingway is also known for his love of food and alcohol, right? In a lot of his novels, he writes a lot of detailed descriptions of the kind of meals that he's eating, a lot of drinking, right? And as you can see, I wrote here, it's noted that he could drink almost anybody under the table, right? And that he was also known, in addition to having 4 wives, right, that he was a womanizer who had many extramarital affairs. But, even given that, given all these things about him, right, throughout his life, his entire life, he was a very disciplined writer who wrote compulsively. He set aside time every day to write, and he often wrote, right, while he was standing up. And maybe this will be my last slide here. So according to legend, right, Hemingway was dared to write a story in 6 words. And apparently he was at a bar and he pulled out a cocktail napkin and wrote, "For sale, baby shoes never worn." Okay, so just 6 words, but I feel like it really does convey a lot there, right? Hemingway supposedly also said, "Write drunk, edit sober," right? And happiness in intelligent people is the rarest thing I know. Very deep. I have a lot here. You can see I really like Hemingway. So if you're interested in talking more about Hemingway, take my American Lit class, English 42, right? Because in that class, we read A Farewell to Arms. Okay, so in this picture on the screen, I just thought that was kind of interesting, right? People are selling a book, right? That is a Hemingway book, but when you open it up, it has alcohol inside. Right? For some reason, I have a feeling that Hemingway would approve of that. I don't think he would approve of this, right? So J. Crew, right, has used Hemingway, right, to sell clothing, right? So the capitalist, right? I don't think Hemingway would support this, but they also the Gap, right? There was a picture of Hemingway wearing khakis, and there was a Gap ad campaign where they had these pictures of Hemingway in khakis, and it said, Hemingway wore khakis, right? They also used Jack Kerouac, right? Kerouac wore khakis. So here, like the picture of Hemingway in a striped shirt, and they're using it to sell, this clothing. Okay, enough about the writer. Let's actually talk about the story, right? The story that I asked you to read for today, right? Soldier's Home, which, as I said, came from this collection in our time. Okay, so Soldier's Home. Where to start? I guess I think maybe the best place to start for right now is just thinking about the title, right? So as I said, I like to talk about the setting and the point of view at the beginning. And so, right, the setting, right? Well, the title gives us some insight. The setting is the soldier's home. Okay, so we're thinking about this young man who has just gone through an extremely traumatic experience, right? He has been a Marine in World War I. And World War I, right, is also a setting, right? Even though he's not physically there anymore, right? We can imagine that he's just come home, right? And we know that he's been home for a month, that he's still in his mind, right, reliving some of his experiences. So let's just say maybe a little bit about World War I, in case maybe it's been a while since you studied World War I, right? So 1914 to 1918, right? So during World War I, more than 16 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives. So it was, one of the worst catastrophes the world had ever known up until that point. Now, World War I was, I guess we could say there were unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction because of modern trench warfare, and also because of new technologies, right? So things like submarines, tanks, machine guns, poison gas, aircraft. Okay, so these new technologies, right, enabled people to kill people quicker, right, and easier. And so you can imagine, right, that up until this point, people thought that technology was there to serve humanity, right? That technology was going to make our lives easier and better. But, when applied to warfare, we can see that technology just resulted in more, death and destruction. Okay, so right, and the setting, that the settings that are referred to in the story, right, when Krebs refers to battles, right, and maybe I'll go ahead and share my screen right now so that we can actually look at it on the page, right? So in this fourth paragraph, right, it says at first Krebs, who had been at, and then Hemingway names 5 battles, right? If you've done if you've studied World War I at all, you probably know that those battles that he names are some of the worst battles of World War I. So we know that Krebs experienced um, a lot of unspeakable horror while he was away at the war. Okay, so he was a Marine who was on the front lines at these horrible battles. Okay, and now, right, as we see from paragraph 3, he's come home. And what's remarkable about his, return home is that we know that he returned right from the Rhine in Germany in the summer of 1919. And that is worth noting because, as we said, World War I ended in 1918. And so it says in the fourth paragraph, right, that all the people have already heard all the war stories, right? Krebs missed the fanfare, the parades, the welcome home. By the time he came home, everybody had already, heard about all the war stories and they were kind of sick of it, kind of bored of it. And so then we learn, it says in the fourth paragraph, right, that right, his town had heard too many atrocity stories to be thrilled by actualities. Krebs found that to be listened to at all, he had to lie. And after he had done this twice, he too had a reaction against the war and against talking about it, right? A distaste for everything that had happened to him in the war set in because of the lies he had told. Okay, now that gives us a lot of insight, right? And then it goes on to say that when he felt the need to talk, nobody wanted to listen to him. Okay, and that what he had to do to get people to listen was tell these sort of sensational lies, right? And I'm just pulling from this paragraph here, right, where it says that, right, that the kinds of lies that people that he might have told, detailed accounts of German women found chained to machine guns, right? These are the kinds of stories that people will listen to, right? They won't listen to, right, they're not thrilled by Krebs stories. Okay, and then we see Hemingway tells us that results in him feeling like he lost everything, right? Him feeling nausea, right? Feeling sick, right? And if we just kind of wrap our heads around that for a minute, imagine, right, when you feel the need to talk about your experience, and that's a very normal thing to feel, right? We all feel the need to talk about our experience because that helps us process and understand our experiences, right? Isn't that kind of what therapy is all about, right? And here, Krebs, who's gone through so much that, when he tries to talk about his experiences, people won't listen, right? That he has to lie to get people to listen, right? And you can imagine how that sort of trivializes, diminishes his lived experience, and it makes him feel nausea. It makes him feel like he's lost everything, right? Well, what has he lost? He's really lost his ability to connect to other people on an emotional level, right? And then I feel like one really important insight we get, right? He tells us in that last paragraph that you can see on the page, that when he does run into another soldier, that then it says, right, he fell into the easy pose of the old soldier, right? And then he can really reveal how he truly felt, right? Which was that he had been badly, sickeningly frightened all the time. Okay, so that was the truth. That was the reality of his experience. Okay. So very interesting. While I have this page up, I'd like to say something about the first 2 paragraphs, because I feel, again, like I said, Hemingway's style. Okay, so he doesn't give us a lot of reflection. Instead, he's giving us these descriptions. Okay. And, if we look at these first two paragraphs, right, so we get some insight about what Krebs was like before the war, right, because it said that he went to the war from a Methodist college in Kansas, and that there is a picture which shows him among his fraternity brothers, all of them wearing exactly the same height and style color. Okay. So this is a picture of his life before the war, right? Where he was in this fraternity of men dressed alike, right? That's his old self. Now we see the same language. There is a picture which shows him, okay, but now on the Rhine with German girls and another corporal. Okay, so, right, a different kind of fraternity of men, right? Another corporal. And now the uniform, right? It says that him and the corporal look too big for their uniforms. So in other words, the uniform is too small, it's too tight. Now, if you've ever worn clothing that is too tight, it's very different than wearing clothing that is too loose. It's uncomfortable, right? And it doesn't look good. And then we also get the detail, right? The German girls are not beautiful. The Rhine does not show in the picture. Okay, so the reality, the girls aren't beautiful, and this famous river, right? This famous river that is sort of like a tourist attraction, it doesn't even show in the picture. Okay, so the reality is very far from the imagined ideal that we might have of a young man, going to war and what that might look like. Okay, so Hemingway describes these two photographs, right, to convey that. Okay, now the thing I really like about this story too is the way the plot unfolds. Okay, so Hemingway, let me stop sharing my screen again. Right, so Hemingway starts with this kind of if we think about a camera, right, he's far away, right, he's not zoomed in. He's giving us, right, this description of Krebs's return to his hometown. Okay, and the way he feels like he needs to lie to get people to listen to him. Okay, so we get this sense that Krebs has changed, but his hometown hasn't, right? And that we also see that Krebs isn't physically injured. So, right, his outward appearance, he seems fine, right? But we start to pick up on the sense that he has changed inside, right? So inward, he's suffering, he's struggling. Okay, so even though he looks fine from the outside, he's really not. Okay, he's lost his self-respect because of the way that people treat him, and he's been through trauma. Okay, now Hemingway, if we again think of this camera, he's zooming in because then he gives us a description of a typical day at home for Krebs. Okay, so what does he do on his typical day at home? Well, one of the things that he enjoys doing is looking at girls, but from a distance. Okay, right, so he goes on to tell us that nothing has changed in the town except, right, the girls have grown up. Now they're, older, they're mature, they've gone through puberty, right? They're young women now. And, we might think that he's going to want to get together with some of these girls, right? But no, right? He tells us that he likes to look at them, but only from a distance. He doesn't want to talk to them. Okay, and we start to pick up on why, right? Because he tells us that he wants to avoid all emotional complications. Okay, so he only likes to see them from a distance. And I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen again so we can actually look at the passage, because I feel like this also illustrates something very important about Hemingway's style. And so again, he's thinking about the girls, right? He doesn't like them when he sees them up close, only from a distance. And then this paragraph right here where he says, this is on the top of page 3 of this PDF, he did not want any consequences. He did not want any consequences ever again. He wanted to live along without consequences. So I'm kind of like, oh my gosh, right? He's basically repeating the same thing 3 times, right? Emphasizing that he does not want any consequences. Okay, now that's important, right? Because if we think about it, when he was in the war, that is the one thing that he could not escape or avoid: consequences, the consequences of his actions. Now that he wants to avoid, right? And I feel like this is also very telling, right? When he's thinking back on the girls in France and Germany, right? He prefers them because there was not all this talking. You couldn't talk much and you did not need to talk. Okay, maybe part of that is because maybe the girls did not speak English, maybe he doesn't speak French or German, okay. But also, the way I view this is perhaps he's referring to prostitutes. I'm just guessing it could be that, right? So like seeing women and sex in this way, right, as like a transaction, is very different than seeing a girl in your hometown and actually like talking to her and getting to know her. The difference is because that is more complicated. That involves emotions. So in a sense, we see another example of how the war, being in the war, has kind of reprogrammed him and the way that he thinks. Okay, so it's changed the way that he sees women. And it's not worth it to him, right? Because he doesn't want to have to go through all this talking. Okay. So much to say here, but I'm moving on because I don't want to make this video too long. So then the last part of this narration, right? Again, the brilliance of Hemingway. If we think about this camera, now he's really zooming in, and he zooms in, and the last part of the story we get, right, a dialogue between Krebs and his mother. Okay, so his mother. So a specific incident in Krebs' life, right, where his mom says, "I want to talk to Harold." Right, and again, I don't think I said anything about the name, right, throughout the story. This third person, right, third person limited. We have the narrator Krebs referred to by his last name only, Krebs. Okay, again, I feel like that has to do with him coming from the military. But yet we see his mom calls him Harold, right? His sister calls him Hare. Okay, so these different identities that he has throughout the story. Okay, so his mom, right, wants to have a conversation with him. So we get this specific incident, right, 1 month after he has returned home, right, from being away at the war. And she is approaching him because she wants to talk. And we see right away where this is going. "Have you decided what you're going to do yet, Harold?" his mother said. Okay. Right. "No," said Krebs. "Don't you think it's about time?" "I hadn't thought about it. God has some work for everyone to do," his mother said. "There can be no idle hands in his kingdom." Okay, "I'm not in his kingdom." Okay, and then she goes on, right, to say, "I've worried about you too much, Harold," his mom went on. "I know the temptations you must have been exposed to. I know how weak men are. I know what your own dear grandfather, my own father, told us about World War I, and I have prayed for you. I pray for you all day long, Harold." And this is my favorite line in the whole story. Krebs looked at the bacon fat hardening on his plate. Okay, now let's kind of think about what's going on here. Right, his mom is trying to direct him towards what she perceives to be, right, sort of like what a young man should be doing at his age at this time: getting a job, right? She's later is talking about all the other boys are getting jobs and getting married. And so she's trying to help him reintegrate, right, to be a productive member of society, right? What's expected of him: get a job, get married. Okay, now we can say, okay, great, mothers do that kind of thing, but yet he's only been home for 1 month, right? I mean, I feel like maybe like that's a little bit unrealistic to expect him to just snap out of, this trauma that he's experienced and just like get back to life as it was before he before he left, right? Because again, right, the war has sort of gradually annulled his humanity. Imagine the constant fear and terror that he experienced being surrounded by destruction and death. It's probably going to take a little bit more than 1 month for him to just snap back into his old life. Okay. And so, right, then when she goes on to talk about the temptations you've been exposed to, I know how weak men are. I kind of feel like there she's referring to, I think, sex, right? These temptations he's been exposed to, right? And now, like, how clueless in a way on her part, because she's treating him like a child. It almost seems like she's more concerned that he's lost his virginity than she is thinking about all the horrors that he has seen. I know how weak men are. What are you talking about? Your son just went through hell. He's not weak. And again, my favorite line, Krebs looked at the bacon fat hardening on his plate. That line says so much, right? That externalization of feeling. Right? What does it suggest? Well, it suggests a lot of time is passing. The mom's blah, blah, blah talking, and the bacon fat is hardening. And then also, like, how gross, how disgusting, right? Looking at the bacon fat hardening on his plate, right? That kind of represents how Krebs feels inside. Please, mother, stop, right? And then she goes on to compare him to other young men. Krebs said nothing. Okay, I'm not going to read all this, right? But then when she says, "Don't you love your mother, dear boy?" Krebs's response is no. Okay, and then, of course, we see his mother starts crying. I don't love anybody, right? That just makes his mom cry more. And then, right, we see the emotional complications. This is exactly what he has been trying to avoid throughout the story, right? He doesn't want to have this like emotional mess that he now has to deal with, right? The crying mother. Okay, so then what does he do? He lies. I didn't mean it. I love you. Or actually, he doesn't say I love you. He says, I didn't mean I don't love you. Okay. So she has made him lie. Right? Again, exactly what he's been wanting to avoid, right? Emotional complications. Okay. So what has Krebs lost, right? Because he uses that line throughout the story, right? That he has lost everything. Okay, well, what has he lost? Well, we see in the story, he seems to have lost the ability to feel, okay, right? Because that requires an emotional balance that he doesn't have right now. Again, he's only been home for 1 month, right? And he is mentally scarred by his experiences in World War I. So he has lost his emotional connection to his family, to his religion, right? Because he cannot pray. And then also to girls, right? Which would be something very normal for a young man at this age to want to be with a girl. He doesn't want that. Okay, so that is what he has lost. His emotional connection to these various systems, right? That most young people embrace. Okay, so I'm going to stop now, right, with my discussion of Hemingway and Soldiers Home. I hope you enjoy the story, and I look forward to reading your thoughts on the discussion board. Have a good rest of your day.